On Christmas morning, at a fork in a woodland track on the northeastern edge of the Black Forest, the snow lay so deep it seemed determined to bury every sound and every trace in the world. It filled the ruts, rounded the roots, softened the stones, and turned the familiar shapes of trees into pale hulks. Even Hans's own breath sounded wrong to him, too loud inside his scarf, then instantly swallowed. 16-year-old Hans Beck was curled beneath a fir tree, wrapped in a Volkssturm coat far too large for him, his teeth chattering beyond his control. The cold was no longer something his skin felt. It was a presence that drilled into bone and slowly congealed the blood. When he blinked, his lashes stuck for a moment, and the simple act of separating them felt like effort. Everything was silent. The silence had weight. It pressed until his eardrums ached, leaving him with only the thudding of his own heart hammering against his ribs and the faint rasp of cloth when he tried to move. A few hours earlier, the ad hoc squad he had been attached to had dissolved in a rout and vanished from contact. He could still see it in flashes that refused to settle into a proper memory. Boots slipping in slush, shouted names swallowed by wind. A hand letting go of his sleeve, the sudden emptiness where a line of men had been. Now he was a single abandoned point on an endless white field, swallowed by fear. His hand was clamped over the breast pocket of the coat. Through the coarse cloth he could feel the hard outline of a small tin soldier, the only object his father had left behind before dying at Verdun, the pitiful source of nearly all the courage Hans had left. He mouthed the spells he had learned from fairy tales and begged the little metal soldier for a miracle. Let me turn into a tree before the Americans find me. Let the snow cover me completely. Let me be mistaken for anything but what I am. In stories, a charm worked because the world agreed it did. A ring would glow, a sword would sing, a soldier made of tin would march and protect. Hans wanted that agreement, that simple rule where meaning could be enforced by belief. Out here, the snow did not care what he believed. No miracle came. Boots crunched through packed snow from more than one direction, steady and professional, with the patient cadence of a hunt. Hans did not even see the men at first. A few short, low English commands cut through the stillness, words he could not fully understand. He raised his hands by instinct, stiff as a puppet. Stumbling from behind the tree, he lurched into view. 4 American soldiers formed a loose half-circle around him. Their muzzles angled toward the ground, but their fingers rested on trigger guards. Muddy snow clung to their uniforms. The cold and exhaustion had carved hard lines into their faces. Their eyes held no surprise, only the focused attention of men completing an assignment. Hans felt like an object found by accident and subjected to a cold evaluation. The corporal leading them, Wilkins, made a simple gesture. One soldier stepped forward and searched Hans quickly and thoroughly, taking an old rifle with almost no ammunition, a bayonet, and an empty rucksack. Nothing about it was brutal, and there were no unnecessary touches. It was efficient, depersonalized, like a procedure, as if Hans were a doorway being checked or a crate being inventoried. Then the corporal, in clearly pronounced German, ordered him to hand everything over, everything in his pockets. Shaking, Hans produced a brick-hard piece of black bread, a few Reichsmark coins, a wrinkled photograph of his mother, and finally the tin toy soldier. He placed it almost ceremonially atop the wretched pile. Against the snow, the flaking paint on the small infantryman caught a faint, inappropriate glimmer. He held his breath and waited for judgment. In his imagination, the little German soldier would provoke them. It would be stomped flat or tossed into the trees with contempt. It should draw some reaction, some ritual punishment aimed at him, the counterfeit soldier, and the ridiculous thing he clung to. That punishment, at least, would mean his fear and loyalty had weight. It would mean they had been seen. If they hated the toy, then the toy mattered. And if the toy mattered, then his father and everything that had been taken could not be treated as nothing. The soldier who examined the toy was young, his face reddened by frost. He picked it up without looking at Hans and treated it like any suspicious piece of metal. He weighed it in his palm, ran a finger along every edge, even checked the base. His expression was a working frown of concentration. Then, for a moment so brief it lasted less than a single heartbeat, he stared at the blurred face on the chipped paint and stopped moving. His gaze drifted past the snowy trees to some distant place that existed only in memory. An attic at home with a dusty toy box. A warm room before the war where a younger brother played with a train under a Christmas tree. The hesitation vanished as quickly as it had appeared. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more the reflex of a muscle. Then he returned to calm, set the toy back among the coins and photograph, and treated it as if it were no different from them. "Clear," he said in English to the corporal, flat-voiced. The entire inspection took less than 10 seconds. Hans froze, stunned. The humiliation he had expected did not come. Neither did anger, curiosity, or even a sneer. What he received was a total disregard so complete it felt cruel. Their logic sat outside anything he understood. The soldier had checked the toy the way an engineer might check a rock for a detonator. Concerned only with physical properties, solid and harmless, blind to every emotion and symbol Hans had poured into it. His first attempt at enduring a symbolic confrontation struck nothing but thick padding. No echo came back, only emptiness. The toy soldier was not treated as a trophy, a keepsake, or a provocation. It was classified as civilian personal effects. That recognition stabbed sharper than the cold. Wilkins nodded. The soldiers gathered all the items into a small canvas bag and cinched it shut. Hans was motioned forward to walk in the middle of the group. He had lost his possessions and the script that had held up the walls inside him. His main goal, to force some acknowledgement of the object he treasured, had been defeated at the first checkpoint by procedural indifference. Snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, and it seemed ready to cover the trivial moment itself. They moved out. Hans trudged in the holes their patrol had stamped into the snow, boxed in on both sides. The canvas bag with his belongings hung from a soldier's webbing and swayed with each step. Each swing pulled Hans's eyes back to it. The bag made a soft, stubborn sound against canvas and metal, a dull tap that told him his life was now a bundled set of items carried by someone else. As cold and panic receded slightly, something sharper replaced them, a restless confusion. He tried to make sense of what had just happened. When the American soldier looked at the toy, something had flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not mockery, something closer to recognition. If so, why had the response been so bland, so dismissive? How could recognition end in that careless placement, as if memory itself were a thing you could set down and forget? The contradiction cracked the fairy tale logic Hans had lived inside, a world of clear loyalties and clear punishments. He tried a second time. This time he did not wait in silence. He probed, cautiously trying to create an opening. He let his footing slip and leaned toward the soldier carrying the bag, his eyes locked on the canvas. His throat produced a few uncertain sounds, half-formed syllables he could not even identify himself. The guard only extended an arm to steady him. The force was measured, official support, and nothing more. His eyes stayed alert, scanning the dark trees on either side, never dropping to Hans. Hans tried again, lower, mixing German with a few English words he had picked up in passing. That toy soldier, it's old, my father's. His voice drowned in the crunch of boots and the distant wind. The nearest soldier might have tilted his head, but it looked more like he was sorting wind noises for threats, not listening to a boy's whisper. At the front, Corporal Wilkins raised a fist. The patrol stopped instantly. Men crouched and aimed their rifles in different directions. Absolute silence fell again, broken only by wind moaning through treetops. Hans's heart climbed into his throat. In that moment, he felt the discipline of the machine more than ever, the way a single signal could lock every body into a shared posture. A few seconds later, the corporal lowered his hand and they moved on. The halt had nothing to do with Hans or the toy. It was standard tactical procedure. A faint hiss of static and a question from the rear command post came through an earpiece. The corporal pressed his push to talk and reported in a voice as calm and concise as a weather update. Sentinel to Keystone. Recovered one enemy straggler at Wooded Crossroads, male, minor, disarmed, no important papers or special equipment found. Over. A moment later, the earpiece answered with the same clipped efficiency. Received, Sentinel. Proceed as planned to Alpha Assembly Point. Over. Hans did not catch every word, but he understood the tone, routine, completion, compression of a messy reality into a handful of cold parameters. Hans Beck, carrying fear and a father's death and a tin soldier, had become one enemy straggler, male, minor, disarmed. The report did not have room for the way his hand shook or for the private gravity of Verdun. It did not have a field for a relic. The toy was not worth mention, swallowed inside no important papers or special equipment. The symbolic conflict he had prepared for did not exist in their radio protocol. It did not even have a code. In their language, he could be a threat or not a threat, armed or disarmed, adult or minor. Everything else was noise. The march continued. Hans began watching the Americans more closely. Their movements were disciplined and practiced, their signals wordless and familiar, but fatigue lay heavy in their faces. It was not the sleepiness of a bad night. It was the long-term wear of cold, mud, and danger, the kind of exhaustion that produces distance and turns the world into a series of tasks. During a brief pause, one soldier pulled a photograph with a bent corner from inside his coat, looked at it for an instant, and shoved it back away. His expression did not change. Another murmured something to a buddy, likely a wish for hot coffee or dry socks, and was silenced by a look that said, "Keep quiet." Even their small desires were regulated, clipped, kept under the same lid as fear. Wilkins walked at the front, back straight, but during a short stop to check his map, Hans saw him remove his helmet and rub his face hard through a glove. He stared at the map for a few seconds in silence, his profile showing a weight that looked like resignation, as if he were thinking again and again and again. Then he replaced his helmet, pointed forward, and returned to the steady tone of command. 1 kilometer, stay alert. These small fragments fell into Hans's mind like ice crystals. He began to sense that these men were not the monstrous conquerors he had imagined. They, too, were trapped in a vast cold system. Execute, report, move, guard. Their feelings, homesickness, fatigue, even that passing blankness of memory were pressed down beneath the demand to finish the task and stay alive. Hans had believed war was a clean contest of loyalty and opposition. Now he brushed against another reality. War was a machine, a huge, complex mechanism that cared only about what was useful. It recognized weapons, equipment, rank, and coordinates. It did not recognize a boy's attachment to a dead father's relic. It did not recognize a soldier's flicker of longing for home. Those things were background noise the machine could not process. His second attempt failed completely. His effort to make someone acknowledge symbolic meaning was swallowed by the patrol's focus on terrain, threats, and time. The resource he needed, any emotional attention or symbolic response from the other side, now seemed absurd and impossible. The tin soldier, along with the boy himself, was being transported and processed toward a file. A deeper helplessness seized him. It did not come from immediate violence. It came from the systematic disregard. He was no longer only afraid. He began to feel a cold, clarifying knowledge within the core logic of this war. He and the thing he treasured most might be nothing at all. The snowfield remained quiet, but the quiet inside Hans had changed. It was no longer only fear. It was the dim perception of a vast invisible machine running with a muted roar. When they reached the Alpha assembly point, the sky still held that thick leaden gray. The assembly point was a seized farmyard, a low stone wall enclosing a patch of snow trampled into muddy slush by countless boots. Other detainees were already there. Most were German stragglers in mixed uniforms. A few were civilians with frightened faces. They crouched in small clusters along the wall while a handful of American soldiers stood guard. The air smelled of damp wood smoke, half-melted snow, and the heavy tension of waiting. A radio antenna jutted from a farmhouse window and spat intermittent bursts of communication. Everything looked temporary and improvised, yet contained by a rushed order. Signs, letters scrawled in chalk on doors, guards positioned in sectors. The chalk marks made Hans think of a schoolroom, and the thought was so wrong in this yard that it felt like another kind of cold. Corporal Wilkins led his team to a lieutenant in charge and delivered a brief report. Hans was motioned aside to wait. He watched the corporal speak with the lieutenant, pointing at a map now and then, his face set in workmanlike seriousness. Hans felt like luggage set down for the moment. In the middle distance, an engine coughed, then steadied. Somewhere a man cleared his throat and spat into the snow as if routine could be preserved by small habits. The canvas bag still hung from the soldier's webbing. As the man shifted his stance, it swung slightly. Hans could not stop staring at it. His heart beat slowly and heavily, tangled with leftover fear and a nearly hopeless expectation. He hated the way his hope kept crawling back, like a hand returning to a hot stove. Maybe here, away from the tree line, in the confusion of a rear position, something would be different. Maybe an officer would recheck the items, notice the toy, ask a question. He told himself he did not need that. Then he felt how badly he did. The report ended. The lieutenant nodded, wrote something on a clipboard, and pointed to a slightly emptier corner of the yard. The corporal turned and walked toward Hans. His face held nothing in particular. He gestured to the soldier with the bag. The soldier unfastened it and poured the few possessions onto a wooden crate, serving as a makeshift table, coins, photograph, black bread, and the tin toy soldier. Against the rough grain of the crate, they looked smaller and poorer than ever. The corporal's eyes swept over the items. Then he looked at Hans and said in accented but clear German, "Your things, count them." Hans stared, shocked. He had imagined an interrogation room, his belongings examined one by one with harsh scrutiny. He had not imagined this bland, almost careless return. The process had been simplified to reduce administrative nuisance. He understood suddenly that disorder itself was a danger to them, and that reducing people to manageable packets was one of the ways you survived. His throat went dry, his stomach tightened. If there was a last chance to force meaning into this, it was now. He had to do something, even if it was only to smear a human fingerprint onto the procedure, to prove there was still a place in the world where an object could be more than its weight. He gathered what courage remained, fixed his eyes on the toy soldier, and spoke in a thin, rough whisper that dragged in the only English words he could reach for. Toy soldier? The moment the words left him, he dropped his gaze, bracing for whatever came. Laughter, annoyance, or worse, the same total disregard. Corporal Wilkins did not answer immediately. He did not reach for the coins or the photograph. With 2 fingers of his worn leather gloves, he picked up the tin figure. He studied it again, slower than the field inspection in the woods. His eyes moved over the faded blue uniform, the raised model rifle, the dull tin showing where paint had peeled away. Then his gaze rose from the toy to Hans's face. Hans was forced to look up. Their eyes met briefly. Wilkins's were gray-blue and bloodshot, heavy with fatigue. Yet beneath that fatigue, something shifted. It was not pity. It was not anger. It was a complicated recognition, as if he were seeing through time and smoke, something familiar that tightened the chest and had to be shoved down again. Hans could not name what Wilkins saw. He only knew the look was real and that it was aimed, for a fraction of time, at him as a person and not as a parameter. It carried the faint shock of 2 private worlds brushing together in the middle of a public machine. Hans felt a childish, desperate certainty that if he could hold that look in place, if he could keep it from slipping back into procedure, then the toy might regain its role and his father might be allowed to matter out loud. The moment lasted no more than 2 heartbeats. Wilkins' mouth pressed into a line, not harsh, but controlled, like a reflex locking a door. He glanced from the toy to the other items, as if running a rapid assessment of risk and value. The conclusion was the simplest one: harmless, personal, no military value. Returning it would not disrupt any procedure and might even prevent needless trouble. He set the tin soldier down in front of Hans and answered in English, steady and without emphasis, "Yeah, keep it." Then he stopped looking at Hans. He motioned for the other items to be pushed across, turned away, and began discussing the patrol's next route and resupply with the lieutenant. From Hans's question to Wilkins's departure, it could not have taken more than 15 seconds. The exchange left no room for interpretation. It was not a favor. It was an efficient decision made at the lowest necessary level of attention. The return was complete. There was no sense of gift, no solemn mercy, not even obvious sympathy. It was an administrative decision based on minimum rationality. The flatness of Wilkins' tone defined the object's status in their system more decisively than cruelty or generosity ever could. A minor personal item, safe to hand back, nothing more. That was the reversal. Hans reached out with a shaking hand and grabbed the cold tin figure, clenching it in his fist. The metal bit into his skin like ice, and at the same time like a hard dose of clarity. Everything he had secretly hoped for, every fantasy of symbolic confrontation, every craving for external confirmation collapsed under that plain "keep it." The toy had not gained the meaning he wanted, not by being prized as a trophy, not by being destroyed as a sign of victory. It had merely been permitted. It had not been returned to a son. It had been cleared back to a detainee whose number was not yet assigned. And in that tiny difference in the language of clearance rather than recognition, his whole private mythology cracked. He had built the toy into a signal flare. He had imagined it could force an enemy to see him as something more than a surrendered boy in an oversized coat. But a signal only works if the other side is listening on the same frequency. The machine running this yard in this war did not receive what he was trying to transmit. It did not reject his meaning with malice. It simply could not register it. Emotion did break, but not as sobbing. It was an avalanche inside his world. He stood in the muddy, cold yard as the noise around him shouted orders. Engines, prisoners coughing, seemed to recede. His attention collapsed into the hard, cold point in his palm. The magic was gone. The fairy tale had shattered. His father's tin soldier had not protected him. It had not made him brave. It had not even sparked enough interest in the enemy to be crushed under a boot for the sake of triumph. It had done nothing. It was merely a crude little metal toy made in 1916. Its paint chipped, its manufacture rough. War had its own massive, cold logic, and that logic had no place for a boy's belief in a father's relic. The goal Hans had pursued, to make meaning and connection through an object and to define himself through symbolic opposition, had been reset completely. What he held was no longer a charm. It was not a badge of shame. It was no symbol at all. It was only itself. A feeling he had never known, made of disillusionment, cold lucidity, and a strange relief, flooded him. A soldier directed Hans to join several newly collected detainees and move into a low barn beside the farmhouse, now serving as a temporary holding pen. Inside, the air was thick with hay dust, damp wool, and the smell of bodies pressed together. A few lanterns hung from beams and threw trembling yellow light across the space. The light made every breath visible in brief, pale clouds, as if the barn itself were exhaling. Hans found a corner against the wall and curled down, turning away from the blank or anxious stares of others. Men shifted and coughed. Someone muttered a prayer under his breath, not loud enough to be answered. Someone else cursed softly, not as an outburst, but as a steady rhythm, like a habit the tongue returned to when it had nothing useful to say. The boards creaked in a slow, complaining way each time a boot moved. Above it all, the lanterns hissed, a thin insect sound that made the silence feel alive. Outside, engines started. Wilkins's patrol had taken supplies, perhaps received a new order, and was leaving again, rolling straight back into the endless snow and danger. The wheel of war did not pause. The sound of the vehicles faded the way a thought fades when you refuse to follow it. Then the barn closed in again, not with walls, but with proximity, the shared air of people being held. The barn was scarcely warmer than the yard. Cold seeped through stone seams in the floor and through gaps in the boards. Hans could feel it as a slow creep up his calves, a numb pressure rather than pain. He noticed, with a detached surprise, that his hands were still shaking. They had been shaking since the trees, since the raised rifles, and they were still shaking now. When no one was pointing a weapon at him, it was as if his body had learned a new rhythm and would not release it. All of his attention rested on his clenched right fist. Slowly he opened his fingers. The tin soldier lay in his palm. In the dim, wavering light, it looked even smaller and older, almost ridiculous. He lifted it to his eyes and for the first time truly looked at it, not with a son begging for protection, not with a prisoner waiting for a verdict, with a new, nearly cruel objectivity, the kind that arrives when you have run out of comforting explanations. He saw the gray tin exposed where paint had flaked away, the edges smoothed by repeated rubbing. He saw the rifle barrel slightly bent from crude casting. He saw the production mark on the base, blurred but legible enough, 1916 and a faint factory stamp. He saw, too, how the figure's posture was stiff and generic, a mass-produced stance meant to be recognized at a glance. It was not his father in miniature. It was not even truly a soldier in any real sense. It was an icon from a factory mold. It was an industrial product, a children's toy made in bulk during another war, ordinary material and simple workmanship, worn down by time. It contained no magic. His father's ownership could not give it power beyond its physical properties. His father's death at Verdun could not pass any real protection or courage through a piece of tin if the world had rules for such transfers. If grief could be converted into armor, then Verdun would have protected every son who survived it. But the world did not work that way, and the snow outside proved it with each silent falling flake. It was only a relic, a conduit that linked a living boy to a vanished time and a vanished man. Nothing more. Even that word, relic, sounded too grand in his head, as if he were trying to dress up a fact he could not bear to face plainly. The knowledge hit like ice water, bringing a sharp chill, but what followed was an unexpected calm. It was the calm of a door closing on a room you had been afraid to enter, then realizing the room is empty. He no longer needed to weave myths around it. He no longer needed to fear its symbolic weight would bring punishment or shame. He no longer needed to demand imaginary strength from it. He understood something else, too. A symbol is a kind of agreement. It needs at least two minds to hold it up. In the woods, he had waited for an enemy to confirm his private story by reacting to it. He had wanted them to certify the tin soldier as either sacred or forbidden. But they did not live inside his fairy tale, and they did not have to. Their system had no place for that kind of meaning. What he had taken for a confrontation had been, for them, a safety check. What he had taken for a verdict had been, for them, an item that either belonged in a bag or did not. It had been permitted precisely because, within war's huge practical rule set, it weighed nothing. It did not belong to military property. It did not even qualify as a noteworthy civilian item. It was harmless personal clutter. That utter marginality at this moment felt like relief. If it was not worth confiscation as a trophy, then it might also be safe from being used against him as a sign. It could slip through the gears because it did not register as part of the machine's purpose. Its meaning no longer needed confirmation from any external system, not from the loyalty drilled into him by German authority, not from an imagined American ritual reaction. Whatever value it had existed in a private domain, no war bureaucracy could understand. It could not be praised by a lieutenant or mocked by a soldier in a way that would decide it. It was his because it belonged to the part of him that did not show up on any clipboard. He pulled out a handkerchief from his pocket, now stained and dirty, and began wiping the little soldier carefully. He rubbed away mud and melted snow, polishing the remaining flecks of colored paint. His movements were slow and focused, as if performing a rite. The handkerchief snagged on tiny ridges of casting, and he adjusted his grip, gentler than he would have believed possible in himself. He was handling a thing that did not matter to the world, and yet mattered to him enough to demand care. This was not a ritual of prayer. It was a ritual of confirmation. With each pass of cloth, the fairy tale of the brave little tin soldier drained away and a tougher, simpler truth sharpened. He had had a father. In years of peace, his father might have set this toy into young Hans's palm. He might have sat with him on the floor and watched imagined battles play out. Hans had once possessed a childhood that did not include artillery, routes, and snow-filled forests. He tried to recall the exact feel of that peace and found he could not. The war years had overwritten it with louder images. What he could almost picture were small fragments that had no heroic shape. A warm hand guiding his, a low voice, the sense of warmth and ordinary life. None of it would interest an army. None of it belonged in a report. That was precisely why it mattered. It belonged to a life that had existed before the machine and might exist again if the machine ever stopped demanding everything. These were not fantasies. They were facts. And this small, cold piece of tin was the only material proof those facts had ever existed. Not proof for historians, not proof for officers, proof for himself. When his own memory began to feel unreliable, under hunger and fear. Outside, vehicles drove off. Wilkins and his patrol were gone toward another coordinate, another reconnaissance sweep, another contact. Whether Wilkins paused for a heartbeat before leaving, whether his eyes drifted toward the barn, no one could know. Even if he did, whatever thought rose in him about a toy soldier, about children inside war, or about nothing more than the next muddy stretch of road, would have been pushed down and left behind, squeezed into the narrow seams between missions. War did not record inner storms. It demanded results, control, movement reports. It demanded that you keep your hands steady even when your mind tried to flee. Hans finished wiping the toy. It looked cleaner now, faintly metallic under lantern light, but still plainly old. He closed his fist around it again, not to draw power from it, but to anchor himself. The grip did not feel like a spell. It felt like holding a nail in a storm, something hard and definite that could not be argued out of existence. He had lost the child's privilege of pouring endless feeling into an object and believing it held magic. He had gained a more adult knowledge, bitter but solid. Some things have value only in the private territory of memory and emotion, and they do not need and often cannot receive recognition from the world's grand narratives. Because that value is private, it cannot be confiscated. You cannot process it, categorize it, or clear it, because it is not an item in the external world. It is a bond in the internal one, and the internal one is the only place the machine cannot fully enter. The tin soldier's status as a non-trophy protected its truest nature as a remnant of his father. The same indifference that had wounded him now acted unintentionally as a kind of shield. The machine did not care, and because it did not care, it did not reach in and break the last thread. The procedures would continue. Later, a sergeant responsible for prisoner transport would come to register names, distribute basic rations, and schedule transfer to a rear camp the next day. Like thousands upon thousands of others, Hans would enter the conveyor belt of Allied prisoner processing, screening, categorization, confinement, and then waiting for the war to end. He pictured himself becoming a line in a ledger the way he had become a line in a radio call, stripped down to what mattered to the system and left there. The broad trajectory of history, the Allies stabilizing after the Ardennes and then driving forward into Germany, would not shift by a fraction because of this small episode on the edge of the Black Forest. His capture and his awakening would be a quiet footnote, unrecorded. But on that cold Christmas day in a dusty barn corner filled with stale air and the steady, uneasy breathing of men who did not know what came next, 16-year-old Hans Beck completed the most bitter and most real lesson of his coming of age. He saw through the emptiness of symbols and faced the smallness and indifference of reality. He learned that the world did not owe his grief a response, and that waiting for a response could hollow you out. What he held was no longer a charm. It was a cold, hard, real piece of history, a truth about loss, about memory, about a tiny past that had survived the crushing wheels and still belonged to him, not because anyone allowed it, not because it had been recognized, but because it lived where recognition did not reach. He pressed it to his chest and closed his eyes, not to pray, but to remember. Outside, the world and the war kept roaring forward. Inside that corner, a boy and his newly defined world reached a silent truce.